The following text is taken from an article from the Scottish Housing News website from the 3rd of September 2020 and entitled, Our Housing Heritage, How Glasgow Tenants Fought the Huns at Home During World War I.
In the latest article in the ongoing Our Housing Heritage series, Scottish Housing News discusses the Glasgow rent strikes of 1915.
In the absence of social housing, families across the UK in 1915 were at the mercy of private landlords who could hike rents and evict tenants at will with little restriction. The outbreak of the First World War exacerbated the pre-existing housing shortages across the country as wartime industry drove hordes of workers into industrial cities. Glasgow saw a huge increase in wartime production in shipyards, engineering workshops, and munitions factories, with newly arrived workers and their families increasing the demand on an inadequate housing supply. Many of the city's landlords sought to exploit the situation. In February 1915, Glasgow landlords informed tenants that all rents would be increased by a whopping 25%. A huge proportion of families, especially those whose primary breadwinners were fighting in the war, could not hope to pay the increased rents. Meetings to resist the rent rises were held all over Glasgow and Govan. These meetings led to the birth of the Glasgow Housewives Housing Association, GWHA, under the chairmanship of Mary Barber. This organization brought the women of Glasgow to the very forefront of the fight against rent hikes and unfair landlords. The rent strike was formally initiated in September 1915, and within just 2 months more than 25,000 working-class Glasgow families were refusing to pay their rents. Sheriff officers and bailiffs who attempted to evict the tenants were met with organized resistance and protests by the Housewives Committee. As many men were away at the war or engaged in other industrial battles campaigning for shorter hours, higher wages, and better working conditions, women were often at the very forefront of the rent strike movement. Female protesters often devised clever strategies to prevent evictions from being carried out. The women utilized the design of Glasgow tenements to their advantage. If strikers were notified of planned evictions in advance, they would pack into the targeted close to prevent officials from entering and securing the tenants from homelessness. In order to guard against unexpected arrival of officials, one person was posted in the close to warn of trouble, and then if an official arrived, they raised the alarm by shouting, banging pots and pans, or blowing whistles. According to reports in the Forward newspaper and corroborated by campaigner Helen Crawford in her diary entries, women would come running into the tenement close with bags of flour, rotten fruit, and even wet washing, and would throw these items at the officials coming to evict tenants, forcing them out of the close. The rent strike peaked in October 1915, with an estimated 30,000 participating. However, a pivotal moment of the movement came on November 17, when a Glasgow landlord named Mr. Nicholson hauled 18 rent strikers into a small debt court. In response to the legal action, the Housewives Committee immediately organized a mass march of rent strikers to the court, and, as they marched in their thousands, industrial workers left their jobs and joined in the protest. The protesters became known as Mrs. Barber's Army. When the protesters reached the court in Brunswick Place in Glasgow, they bombarded the sheriff with their statements, with most strikers threatening industrial action if the cases were not withdrawn. Eventually, the sheriff conceded and urged the landlord to withdraw his cases against the rent strikers. Several huge demonstrations were planned for November to demand that rents be frozen at pre-war levels. However, fears over larger civil disturbances and the serious threat of huge industrial action and work stoppages forced the UK government to take action. The protest was seen as a momentous victory, not only in Glasgow but all over the UK, as on November 25, 1915, the government introduced the Increase of Rent and Mortgage Interests, War Restrictions, Act, which restricted increases in rent and the rate of mortgage interest during the First World War.